This is at heart not a black and white question. This is a revolt of the millennials. It's a revolt of the people who either came of age or were born even after the turn of the 21st century, who realized instinctively at first, and now can read in black and white, that the future for them looks grim, that they are a generation that cannot look forward to a better life than their parents had. In fact, can almost certainly look forward to a worse life than their parents had. Of course, that underlying assumption of mine is acted on by many things. The first is the special oppression, the special exploitation of people of colour in most places in the world, in fact, but nowhere more so than in the United States. Born of the original sin of the looting, yes, capital L, looting of the entire subcontinent from the people who lived there, whose land it was. Columbus didn't discover America. There was 100 million people already living there. They called them the Red Indians. We call them the Native Americans. Where are they now? Almost entirely wiped out in one of the worst genocidal bouts of white colonial power in history, and there have been many more. I should have mentioned Belgium earlier, where they're trying to tear down the statue of Leopold of the Belgians, a man who personally, not the state, who personally owned what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and massacred millions of Africans there in the process of looting, yes, capital L, looting the Congo. And of course, Leopold was merely more gruesome than the other imperialist warlords who sacked Africa and stole everything that they could carry, including the human beings that Edward Colston, the Bristol slave trader, shipped out of Africa across the sea to work until they dropped as enslaved people in chains, the property of white slave owners. That's what Edward Colston was. He transported more than 80,000 black Africans from Bristol, from Africa, to the United States and the Caribbean. 10,000 of those slaves that Colston transported died on the voyage in those ships that Bob Marley sang about, those slave ships. Now, the big question, as I said in my introduction, is why there was ever a statue to a slave trader in Bristol in the first place. Certainly in modern times, seems inconceivable that you would commemorate such a man. But when you look more closely, practically everything in Bristol is named after Edward Colston because, of course, like many a magnate, he donated a small portion of the profits that he had made from the blood of the Africans to good works in his home city of Bristol. There's not just a statue. That building behind the statue is named after him. There's a grammar school named after him, a girls' school named after him. There's parks named after him. And of course, he was just one of the slavers who built their entire financial empire on the enslavement, brutal killing, torturing, and enslavement of black African people. So don't act surprised if in the middle of a wave of protests against racism against black people, that the statue of a slaver ends up in the drink. The very drink that, as I said, he once made foam with the blood of black Africans. But of course, it's not just Bristol. It's not just Bristol and Liverpool. It's not just Bristol and Liverpool and Glasgow and London. The British Empire was built on the enslavement of Africans. So the next time you see a black fellow walking down the street and you feel a bit nervous, just remember, he's got much more to be nervous about of you than you do of him. So racism, police brutality, my God, have you ever seen anything like the activities of New York's finest, Philadelphia's finest, the finest in LA, in Florida, in Houston? Have you ever seen anything like these videos that are coming out hourly on social media of US police ruthlessly brutalizing women? I saw them today shoot a man in a wheelchair in the face, in his wheelchair. They are kneeling on people's necks, still. They are choking people, still. Well, I suppose habits die hard, because last year alone, United States police officers killed 1,100 people in a single year. The British police, in the same year, killed 3 people, and one of them was the terrorist at London Bridge. 1,100 people in a year, and overwhelmingly they were black people, people of color. And now in Washington, D.C., they are reaping the whirlwind. So gigantic are the crowds in D.C., outside the White House, that the president is almost certainly in a bunker. Yes, a bunker, where he's firing off orders, pronunciamento. Remind you of anyone? Remind you of any time in history? Bunker boy? He declared earlier this week in the Rose Garden that he was going to send the United States military, the Marines, the Airborne Division, onto the streets of his own country, occupying his own country with his own country's armed forces. Makes a change, of course, from invading and occupying these cities of other people. Now, he was promptly contradicted by his own defense secretary and by the chief of his military. And it hasn't happened yet and may not happen. But it's a sign of the desperation of the political class in the United States. The Republicans, of course, are calling all the shots, but they can only do so because of the active collaboration of the so-called opposition party, the so-called Democrats. In fact, as I said here last week, and as my guest, Chris Hedges, said here last week, Joe Biden and Barack Obama, and in particular Joe Biden, the now Democratic Party challenger to Donald Trump, they actually wrote the textbook. They wrote the handbook, which has led to the kind of atrocious violence that we have seen in the United States over the last 12, 13 days. It was Joe Biden that consigned half a nation full of black Americans to the gulags of the prison system, which have been turned, paradoxically or not, into profit centers. They are America's cheap labor in these prisons. And they actually need an endless supply of workers going into the prison to keep the profits rolling. Joe Biden is the author of all of that. Joe Biden is the man who gave the eulogy to Thurmond, the ideologue, the guru of segregationism in the United States. He can try and rewrite his own history. He can invent his role in the civil rights movement, of which there is not a scintilla of evidence. Neither was he arrested in South Africa trying to reach Nelson Mandela. That was me, Joe. That was me. You plagiarized me. Joe Biden is not the man to confront racism in Washington or in the United States of America. But as I said at the beginning, this is not actually a black and white issue. Of course, colour, race act as exacerbators of pre-existing conditions. Let me tell you something from my own life. In 1984-85, as an honorary member of the National Union of Mine Workers, we faced every single day shocking, appalling, brutal police savagery on the picket lines and far from the picket lines, far from them, during that miners' strike. And every one of us was white. Not even coal dust to be seen. White working class people defending their communities, their livelihoods, fighting not for money but for the right to continue working in the pits around which were built their communities of hundreds of thousands of people. The cops were all white, and the miners were all white, and 90% of their supporters who were not miners were white. You didn't need a black face in Britain in 1984-5 to be clubbed by the police and for it to be lied about, for it to be turned on its head as if it was you that clubbed the police and not the other way around. Every Saturday evening in the 1980s, for months, I stood at the gates of Wapping with the print workers, being charged by police horses, and all of the printers were white, and all of the cops were white. Over the last 15 months, the yellow vests in France, overwhelmingly white, were attacked with the most appalling, vicious violence by the state forces in France, who cared not that they were the same colour as the cops doing the attacking. The police, the security services, the state exists to protect the status quo, the prevailing orthodoxy, the current balance between rich and poor, the current balance of power in our society. So, that being so, let me repeat what I said earlier. I'm against riots. I've always been against riots. Riots are not revolts. Riots are not revolution. Rockets go up in the sky like riots, in a blaze of flames and colour, but they come down like a burnt stick and they leave only scorched earth behind them. The scorched earth of other people's property, the scorched earth of other people's lives. And even worse than that, they strengthen the power, they strengthen the narrative of the powerful against whom all of us ought to be ranged. They help the right, they help reaction, and eventually the Black Hundreds, like those pogromists in Russia before the revolution, the reaction will move onto the streets and the blood and violence will be terrible. The armed reactionaries in the United States, the armed gunmen of Trumpism cannot be long delayed from coming on to the streets of America, and they will do so if they can, hiding behind a narrative that these people are not protesters, these people are not even revolutionists, these people are mindless anarchistic thugs who are killing and maiming and breaking and inflaming and destroying everything in their path. So most of the people on the streets of London over this weekend, and they're still on the streets right now, most of those people had no intention to harm anyone. But there is a small contingent who stay behind, whose purpose is to do as much damage, create as much mayhem as they possibly can. And not only is that wrong morally and in principle, it is wrong in practice because it can only divide our people at a time when they need to be united. To desecrate war memorials is a crime against the memory of those who died to protect our freedoms. To desecrate Churchill, for example, who undoubtedly was a racist. He's in our Hall of Fame and our Wall of Shame, for God's sake. But if it wasn't for Churchill becoming Prime Minister in 1940, we would all be slaves. We would all have been enslaved under the great slaver, Adolf Hitler. So this kind of action is foolish. It's foolish, it's ignorant, and it helps the enemies against which these brave demonstrators are ranged. Now, my last point in the time I've got available is on the coronavirus. It is evident that the lockdown, quarantine, social distancing is all now defunct. Although, as I said last week, we never really had a lockdown. We never really had quarantine. Because right from the very beginning, I'm leaving aside the weeks that the government had to act and didn't, but just from the beginning of when they did act, they called it a lockdown, but it wasn't. They called it quarantine, but it wasn't. They called for social distancing, but there was none. They sent inessential workers out to work day after day, infecting each other, as well as the transport workers who had to carry them to work. They allowed the Cheltenham Racing Festival to be attended by 250,000 people. They allowed the Atletico Madrid-Liverpool game to go ahead, again infecting thousands of people. They allowed 24 million people to fly into Britain, often from the very epicenters of what was then a raging pandemic, which has now laid waste to millions of people's lives and has killed hundreds of thousands of people. There was no lockdown. And now there isn't even the pretense of a lockdown. Now, one of the reasons why I was not demonstrating on the streets of London today is because it seems to me self-evident that we in Britain and in the United States are going to suffer a second wave of coronavirus infection, which will potentially dwarf the first phase, which has been so ruinous, so disastrous. I wear gloves, I wear a mask, I scarcely go out, because I believed in what to me was the obvious point, that if you stay far enough away from as many people as you possibly can, then you will slow down the transmission of this virus. All of that is now defunct. And they accelerated towards its current position of defunct when Boris Johnson, while I was on the air just a couple of weeks ago, ordered everyone back to work, ordered the shops, inessential shops, to reopen. And before long, we will, I'm sure, be reaping the whirlwind of that ghastly, grotesque error of judgment too. And then again we'll pay a price for having neglected, atrophied, and sold off so much of the essential public infrastructure that we would have needed to successfully fight against this great challenge of the coronavirus. It's only 6 months ago you were wishing people a Happy New Year. Amazing, isn't it? 2020 is definitely turning out to be a year to remember, and not for a good reason either. I'll be here until 10 o'clock with the mother of all talk shows.